Welcome. We're really excited. This is our pilot's first in a series of parent workshops, and we're going to be doing them throughout the school year. And at the conclusion of this, I will go ahead and send a schedule of all of the upcoming dates and the topics. But the one that you're attending tonight is Parenting Through the Pandemic. It looks like we actually have quite a few people here, so thank you for being here, and thank you for helping us launch this series. We at Pilot have been very lucky because we have been able to be in person this school year so far since September. And, part of that's due to the fact that we have a state-of-the-art building, we have 50 acres campus, and, we have small class sizes anyway. So that's really made it very conducive to doing this safely. We do know that not all schools have had, not all schools or families have had that opportunity, and that this is a fairly hectic time for anybody, and for parents, I think, in particular. So I'm going to share the screen with, hold on, I'm not sharing my screen. I'm still figuring out the technology, so bear with me here. Okay. There, that show up properly? So this series of parent workshops we're doing in conjunction with Dr. Keaney Winklespecht, and we're really thrilled to have her as a presenter for all of these presentations. And Keaney came up with the idea of doing this Parenting Through the Pandemic because, between school closures and working remotely and physical distancing, it's just a lot to navigate, and let alone navigate as a parent. So Dr. Winklespecht is going to give us some of her thoughts this evening and some takeaways that hopefully will help you all at home. And just to give you a little background about her, she is a child clinical psychologist who works with children and families from preschool through high school. She's in private practice in North Wilmington at Child Psychology Solutions, and we're happy to have her as our presenter. I'm going to pass the screen over to Dr. Winklespecht. There will be a chance to ask questions, and you can do it either in the chat or in the Q&A part. They may get answered during the presentation. Dr. Winklespecht and I can see them. They may be answered during it, or they may be held and answered at the end. But either way, we will get to your questions. So also, just the last thing is we are recording this presentation. So if you want to go back and revisit it or share it with others, that's going to be fine. Okay, so I will let Dr. Winklespecht take it from here.
All right, that sounds great. I'm going to share my screen now.
Let me stop sharing.
And I should be able to do the slideshow. Let's see. There we go. All right, well, welcome everybody. Good evening. As Janet said, I'm Keaney Winklespecht. I usually go by Dr. Keaney because it's much easier for everybody to say, right? Winklespecht is a little bit of a mouthful. And I'm really excited to be partnering with Pilot to do a series of parent workshops. So this is the first in a series of 6, as Janet said, and I think it's really been a unique time for all of us probably, right? 2020 is unlike any year that we've ever really had before. And I think as a psychologist, right, we've seen a lot of things that we, never anticipated kind of seeing before. As parents, we've seen that as well. I will share I'm also a parent. So I have a middle schooler and an elementary school child myself. And so I think a lot of some of the lessons that we're going to kind of talk about and think about, I think we've all had to work to figure out how do we adapt to the new situation that we're in. And over time, as the pandemic has kind of gone on longer than any of us would really hope, I think we've also learned some things along the way that would be helpful tips to share, and what we're learning kind of coming out of the initial kind of research about how it's impacting parents, how it's impacting adults, and how it's impacting kids. And so hopefully some of these strategies will be helpful as we continue to navigate this together. Again, Pilot has been able to go back to school in person, which is amazing, and provides a great opportunity for all the kids who attend there. I also know that as families, you have kids probably who are in multiple schools, and so that might not even be the same for everybody in your household, right? That everybody's still having the chance to go back to school. So we'll think about some of those challenges too. So I thought as a starting slide, right? So anytime that I feel like these 4 items have been like the most popular items, or we're running out and people are texting about like Target having wipes and people can go and kind of get them, it really sets the tone for kind of what this year has been like. So we've been focusing on hand sanitizer, right? Lysol wipes, having to wear face masks, and everybody really having to figure out where do we find those and make those a part of our daily life. And then of course, you know, toilet paper. Who knew, right, that that would become such a hot item as well. So these top items of 2020, I think, really speak to the level of kind of stress that I think we all experience, that these basic necessities and things that we really wouldn't have anticipated needing before became really critical items. So I think they kind of symbolize how we've had to shift pretty quickly from our kind of typical day-to-day. As Janet said, as we go along through the talk tonight, if you guys have questions, please send them to us. So we can certainly be flexible. If there's a topic or question that would be helpful for us to stop and answer then we're certainly happy to do that. Don't feel like you have to wait. We want to make sure that this is engaging and helpful to everybody, because you all are taking out some of your evening time to join us. And so we want to make sure that it's as relevant as it can be for everybody. So I think tonight what we're hoping to do is to really think about a roadmap through uncertainty. So I think in times where we don't necessarily know, we don't really have an idea about where, you know, 2020 is going. It's really difficult sometimes to feel like we have a path toward kind of our normal routine, our normal day-to-day, because everything is so different. And so I hope tonight that we'll work together to really develop that roadmap. And we'll do that in these kind of 4 ways. We'll move through these 4 areas. So parents and kids' mental health. We'll talk about what do we know about the impact of COVID-19 so far. And a lot of that data, again, we're going to think about that for adults, we're going to think about it for parents, and then we're going to think about it for kids. Discussing some key factors that really make the pandemic especially difficult. So I think there are 4 things that really make managing this pandemic, not necessarily in just the short term, but now the long term, especially difficult for parents and kids. And we'll think through those factors together. Identifying ways that parents and kids can have an impact on these factors. So the 4 factors that we'll talk about, what are strategies for each one of those 4 factors, and how do those help to promote positive coping? I think especially when we were talking about this workshop series with the school, then we really felt strongly that also headed into the winter and continuing this pandemic again across what is nearing close to a year, that I think some of the factors that we'll talk about and the impact it's had on day-to-day life becomes more draining. And so hopefully some of these things will be helpful as we're thinking about, you know, entering those winter months as well. And then obviously we want to answer questions. So answering questions about parenting through the pandemic, anything that's kind of brought up from the information that we're talking about tonight. Just a quick note as well. So information today, we're really thinking about for kind of education. So our goal is to really provide kind of education about mental health that's really relevant for kids and parents. It's not a substitute or kind of offered as a specific therapy intervention. So if that's something that you feel like your child or family would benefit, then you can reach out to Pilot or reach out to me, and we're happy to connect about resources. I will include some of those in the presentation today. So being a parent in 2020, parents were immediately faced with multiple changes in daily life. Everybody probably remembers that day in March, right? I remember, right? It was March 13th that we got the notification. There was a little bit of buzz before that, but on the 13th that schools were closing and that they were going to be closing very quickly. And so overnight and over that weekend, we really had to think about remote working. So not going into the office anymore and working from home, or trying to figure out, again, not everybody is able to do that, right? So many people still continue to work outside the home. Remote learning and doing 100% kind of online education and having to pivot overnight. Being responsible for, in some part, kind of teaching kids of all ages, right? So your preschoolers through your high schoolers, really having some responsibility over making sure that their needs were met related to learning. Activities were canceled. So theater activities, music lessons, play dates, sports, everything kind of stopped and halted. Stores and restaurants closed. I think the computer technology has also been a big challenge as well. So thinking about our internet access and capacity, Zoom, what's our best camera angle? How are we going to think about setting these things up? and mastering the technology to do that. You know, who has phone access? We're competing over multiple devices all day. Wasn't something we experienced before. Kids being home 100% of the time. Usually kids were in school a lot of that day and we're doing other activities. And so we weren't used to everybody being home all the time. Childcare challenges, so daycares being closed, babysitters being unavailable, and then workforce reductions, job changes, and the things kind of associated with that. So I think these are some of the things that as we talk through those, I'm sure are resonating with you guys as it's tough, right? So being a parent in 2020, again, is unlike any other year, but having 2 or 3 of these things happening would be really stressful. Having all of these things happen in a very short period of time, it's no wonder that there was a lot of stress associated with that. I would be surprised if parents and families and kids didn't feel a lot of stress, you know, and teachers, everybody I think was feeling the impact. So being a kid in 2020, kids went from going to school one day and then next day, not, right? And their whole world changing as well. And so I think from a kid's perspective, it's important to kind of step back and I think about how some of those changes really felt for them too. Some of them were the same and some of them would obviously be different from their perspective. So no school. So schools did kind of shut down for a certain period of time where there wasn't necessarily online learning to help to make this shift. Remote school, 100% online learning. So either being on the computer 100% of the time, being on Zoom, a combination of Zoom and worksheets. Asynchronous learning. I don't know about anybody else, but that was not a term that I actually even knew was a term before the summer. I did not know that that was a thing and that we've had to quickly figure out kind of what is asynchronous learning and think through that. Parents were now teachers from a kid's perspective and asking them to do a lot more things each day. So parents weren't just helping to, right, kind of get you ready for school, do homework, get you ready for bed, you know, play, hang out. They were also then doing all of that middle part of the day to make sure that you were engaged in learning and really being responsive to the school and the needs that you had at school. Parents have a lot of work calls, right? So think about what kids were seeing at the time that, you know, parents were having to work remotely as well and have their whole day work at home. So a lot of work calls and Zoom meetings where they can't answer questions or find the TV remote, right? Some of the things that kids are really worried about. What do I do, right? If I have to have this happen, what do I do if the Wi-Fi goes out? What happens if I don't click the right button on the Zoom meeting? Kids needed a lot of support at the same time that parents were then juggling those work responsibilities. Having limited or no activities, not being able to see your friends or even your family, and having to just isolate with your own immediate family. You certainly had to wash your hands a lot, right? Way more than I think kids have ever been thinking about washing their hands before, and not really having any alone time. So as we go through this list, again, it's no wonder that kids were also experiencing a lot of stress. Again, some of these things are very similar to what parents were experiencing. They're just kind of experiencing it developmentally in a different way. But some of those things are very different. And I think it's helpful to kind of keep both of those perspectives in mind. So what do we know so far about the impact of mental health on parents? We've just started to get some data about what this is going to look like. And so really thinking about, you know, what is this pandemic having as an overall impact on mental health? So the CDC published a study in August 2020. So this survey data that is below was from a survey that they did of adults, so 18 plus, June 20th through the 30th. So that was, you know, from March until the end of June. So we'd had several months of the pandemic and most of the lockdowns during that time. So a little over 40% of adults reported at least one adverse mental or behavioral health condition. A little more than 30% of that was anxiety or depression based. 26% was more a trauma-related stressor, so something very specific related to the pandemic itself. So, right, experiencing a loss related to that, or having like nightmares or those types of things related to the pandemic. 13% reported, a little more than 13%, beginning substance use or increasing substance use to cope with the pandemic. So not necessarily having what they felt like were kind of as many positive coping options. A little more than 10% reported having seriously considered suicide in the last 30 days. That's an alarming statistic, so that's a high number. And again, I highlighted a few of the groups that they found. So in this kind of group of 10, a little more than 10% who were having those serious thoughts, those thoughts were higher for some groups of people. So higher for essential workers, higher for 18 to 24-year-olds, and higher for unpaid caregivers of adults. So those who were in a position to care for other people as their kind of 100% caretakers. So for disabled relatives or elderly relatives, the stress was especially hard on these particular groups. Another study, the U.S. Department of Commerce really was thinking about how was the childcare impact and work from home impacting kind of what parents would need. And 63% of parents said that they needed to change their childcare at some point in the next year. And that's a recent study, that's from August. So still at this point where we are in the pandemic, most of the country is thinking about having to shift childcare arrangements at some point in the next year, which is really hard. You know, I'm sure everybody has experienced a change in childcare situation related to the pandemic, but even if we thought about that beforehand, right, if your kids went from a baby classroom to a toddler classroom, that those transitions were stressful. So that creates its own stress for parents and families. A New York Times study just in September was looking at kind of what does this landscape look as we head into the fall. So 1 in 7 kids were predicted to return to school in person at all. So that's a hybrid, or that's 100% of the time. 4 in 5 parents would not have any in-person help during the school day. So like for all of those remote learners and parents who are juggling work responsibilities, that many people were not going to have other support during the school day. And 80% of parents working remotely would also handle education and childcare during the pandemic, so that you would have that kind of that second job responsibility. I also wanted to kind of highlight some of the worries that parents had, right? So for moms and dads, the New York Times has done a pretty good job, I think, of actually collecting, kind of keeping track of data on kids and families during this pandemic, especially related to the school. And thinking about the worries that parents have and concerns. So exposure to COVID, social skills, and mental health were the top 3. You can think about that social skills part. Again, limiting the activities to the extent that we have certainly has a great impact on, you know, thinking about younger kids developing those social skills, but for older kids really being able to exercise those in healthy ways. Academic progress, consistency in routines, screen time, sports activities, you know, relationships with adults at school. You know, you can see again how we're kind of rounding out this list, and access to healthy food, that all of these things are big concerns that parents have for this year, again, headed into kind of this new academic year. So what do we know about kids so far? So that's some of the specific data that I thought would be relevant for us to highlight related to parents and related to adults. And what do we know about that for kids? Kids are, in general, there are more restrictions on kind of studying the mental health of kids, right? It's hard actually in a pandemic to get kids to be able to complete any research studies. If you think about access, right? Kids don't have access to their own devices and are not in schools where some of this data would have originally been collected. So a lot of what we're seeing is gathered from other countries. Also because other countries started the pandemic a little bit earlier, right? So it takes kind of about 3 to 6 months to publish data like this. So we're seeing some of that initial data start to come out. So from a global perspective, 99% of the world's children are living with some restriction on movement, meaning that they can't go places that they would typically go, or, you know, are confined to some of their home for some of the time. 60% are under some form of full or partial lockdown. And 1.5 billion children are out of school. So either not going to school at all or not able to attend in person, which is just a staggering statistic, I think, the impact on academics. And again, I think the importance of schools for our kids' social and emotional health is huge. So looking at some more specific data about mental health, one of the studies coming out of China was really looking at 7 to 18-year-olds. And what they found was that 22%, a little over 22% of their 7 to 18-year-olds reported symptoms of clinical depression. And that's about a 10% increase in what we would say is the typical base rate of depression. And so a 10% increase is pretty high in that short period of time. Another study for middle school and high school students, also from China, found that 43%, a little more than 43%, had symptoms of depression. A little more than 37 had some symptoms of anxiety, and 31% of the sample reported symptoms of both, so having both depression and anxiety. Symptoms they found were worse for girls than boys, and also got more significant as kids got older. So as they made this middle school to high school transition, and we can think about why that would make sense. Older kids probably have a little bit more freedom and, you know, are reliant on more of those outside the home kind of social activities than middle schoolers are sometimes. And so the impact was a little bit greater. Another study really looked at what parents were reporting about kids. And I think this is helpful as we're thinking about how to really help kind of parent through this pandemic. So what were kids really, or what were parents really noticing rather about their kids? So this was a survey of parents of 3 to 18-year-olds in Spain and Italy. 85%, an enormous majority, were reporting that they saw emotional and behavior changes of their children during quarantine during this time. I would be surprised again if that number wasn't pretty high, because I think this was such a drastic change from, again, day-to-day life before that. And you can see kind of the list in order of significance here. So most were reporting changes in concentration, followed by boredom, increased irritability, a lot of restlessness. You know, as you don't have outlets for that energy and activity, you see a lot of restlessness, increased nervousness, for a lot of reasons, right? Because your schedule's changing and you have a lot of uncertainty and you're not necessarily sure what's going to happen next. But I think that's also about the, you know, safety in the pandemic itself, you know, who might get sick. And then loneliness was the other one. So loneliness has been a big factor as well, that when we take kids kind of out of a lot of those environments, then they're really missing, right, that connection and that connection with other people. 75% of parents reported stress about the quarantine. And parent stress was found to be associated with higher behavioral and emotional symptoms. So kids certainly recognize when parents are stressed, and it impacts their behavior and emotions in a challenging way as well, right? Both for the positive, but also in this study, they were seeing that it impacted that in kind of a negative way, that stress, again, resulted in more emotional and behavioral challenges for kids. So this is tough data. Preparing for this presentation and looking through all this information, I think it's helpful to, sad to go through that information, but also really important for us to kind of understand and recognize and validate that this has been hard. This has been really tough. This is not something that I feel like everybody is just managing great and no problem. You know, I'd be really surprised if people said, you know, they're doing fantastic in the course of quarantine. But I think this data really helps to kind of anchor us that the challenges that you're experiencing, that we're not alone, that many other people are feeling the same way. And that it certainly makes sense based on some of the restrictions that were kind of in place. And so I want to shift at this point then to kind of thinking about what do we know then about that data? So all those data and numbers that we talked about before, kind of what are some key factors that we feel like we're predicting these kind of worse outcomes and predicting stress? And then how do we really be active change agents? So how can we really work toward establishing ways to really make an impact and a positive change in terms of coping moving forward? So I think I like this diagram because I feel like it also creates a lot of and shows a lot of the overlap in some of the concerns that you're seeing. So I think the big four that really stand out to me and kind of working with families through this pandemic and I'm looking through this data is uncertainty. So when we are facing situations that are uncertain, it's very unsettling. Right? It creates a lot of nervousness and anxiety and stress. It creates some kind of hopelessness. That uncertainty and that feeling of we're not really sure what's going to happen next is very unsettling for people. I think similar to that is a lack of predictability. So that things that you could really count on day to day being very similar, all of a sudden we couldn't really predict what those days would look like. I think people probably remember, right, the first days and months and weeks of this pandemic when we were getting a lot of different information all the time, right? Even school schedules were changing and parent work schedules were changing. When you're available in a given day is also different. And so we couldn't really predict things like you would be able to predict them before. And that lack of predictability creates some kind of instability and stress. Fear. I think everybody was really worried, right? We're still worried about coronavirus. We still have all these precautions because we're concerned about it and that it hasn't gone away and that we have to continue to be vigilant. And so when we're facing a situation where there's a lot of fear, it's really challenging to figure out kind of how to get past that and how do you navigate around that because the fearful situation hasn't gone away. Loneliness. That's the other one. So a lot of what, again, I think the precautions related to physical distancing, kind of the partial or the full kind of lockdown, the quarantine or remote learning has really resulted in a lot of kind of lower social connectedness, lower opportunities for that because of, again, prioritizing safety. And so I think all four of those areas are really creating an impact. And so we're going to focus on each of these four areas to think through some strategies that could be helpful. I'll pause here in case there are any like reactions to the information that we talked about so far or any questions that have come up. I don't know that I've seen a question, but I don't know if I'm focusing on that top of the screen. Janet, have you seen any questions come up or?
I do not see any questions. I just
Okay.
checked both the chat and the Q&A, so I
Okay.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. So if anything comes up or you guys have reactions to that, again, please let us know. I know it's a lot of information to take in. So let's focus first on creating certainty during uncertain times. So when we're faced with uncertainty, then what are we going to think about? So in my mind, as a psychologist, I always want to think about kind of what's the positive opposite of a lot of these stressful situations. So what can we identify that are some behaviors that would really help us to kind of do the opposite? So when we have a lot of uncertainty and we're not sure what's going to happen, then I think we really want to work to create some certainty day to day. So things that kids can count on, things that parents can count on, to really help them to understand, how to kind of navigate through this new normal. So creating activities that kids can count on. What can kids really rely on in the day? Again, they used to rely on a lot of things that they can't necessarily do now or that change, right? Even today, for instance, right? So the governor issued new rules today about youth sports. So things that, you might have been able to do last week, you can't necessarily do now. So really creating these predictable activities. And again, a lot of these are going to occur in the context of your home. And that's what we're kind of focusing on because that's in the environment that you can control the most and that you can impact the most. So this first concept is kind of technically called in the kind of parent behavior management world is really called special time. I think in the pandemic, I really thought about this as a way that you can really have a designated kind of one-on-one time daily with each of the kids in your home to the greatest extent that that's possible. So spending that time to connect and really help them to know that that's a priority, to know that that's something each day that they're going to be able to count on and that they're going to be able to kind of come to you and have this time that they can share thoughts, feelings, that you can relax and have fun. Research would say that even if we had a lot of disruptive behavior, so a lot of the data that we're seeing said that kids had an increase in disruptive behaviors and challenges managing emotions. And so this strategy is a technique that's really effective in helping kids to really manage kind of challenging behaviors. And so research would tell us that doing this daily one-on-one time for between 5 and 15 minutes of a child-focused activity, something that's fun. For younger kids, that's going to be more play-based. And so younger kids are going to be creative and want to think and be silly and kind of have fun in that time. I think older kids won't necessarily always tell you that they want this time, but I think it's really important because I think the playfulness sometimes in the way that younger children kind of drive for your attention is a little bit different than older kids. And so you see a little bit more of that withdrawal and isolation. And we want to make sure that they're kind of getting this daily connected time too. So for older kids, this can be 5 to 15 minutes of chat time, time to watch funny YouTube videos together. It can look a little bit different, but making sure that you're really designating that time to connect with them. Again, if I really only taught this skill of special time alone for kids that were having a lot of disruptive behavior in a clinical situation, it would reduce that behavior in about 3 to 6 weeks. You wouldn't actually see those disruptive behavior, the arguments, the oppositional behavior really occur if you spent this 5 to 15 minutes every day. It's not the quantity of time that you're spending, it's really the quality of time. As a psychologist, I really believe in this particular skill, but I couldn't do special time and be that focused and, not have to do dinner or have other competing demands for really more than kind of 15 minutes. And so you really want to make sure that you're focusing on what's the quality of that time and what you're doing with your attention during that time to help them really feel heard and loved and know that they can kind of count on that. And kids will really enjoy this time and they'll be able to look forward to it in their days, even with all of the kind of chaos of what might be happening around them, that this is something they're going to be able to know is going to happen and feel good about each day. I think another thing that you can really create during the week are fun themes for certain days of the week. So really trying to kind of make something out of nothing, right? We probably didn't all have themed days of the week beforehand, right? I don't know, other than Taco Tuesdays, right? It is a Tuesday, right? And I really enjoy Mexican food. So, right, we always had Taco Tuesday, but in terms of these other days, these were not things that I really would have thought about doing. But I think for kids, it really gives them something to look forward to in the week and know that they can kind of count on this. So even if they've had a challenging day, they've spent, they've had a lot of schoolwork to do, they've had a lot of, again, kind of changes in some of their activities, that they can look forward to some of these kind of themes in the week. Wacky Wednesdays, right? So that could be anything that you really want it to be. It could be different every week, but it could be a real bright spot in the week that everybody really looks forward to and can count on. Providing daily reminders of successes is really important. So in a time where there are this many stressors and where mood is a little bit lower, again, thinking about that headed into the winter in particular, when we have less time to get outside and some more of those physical activities I think that we've been relying on because of the pandemic, we really want to make sure that you're highlighting and focusing on positive each day. Every day has successes. So finding a time each day where you're sharing 3 positives or successes from the day. And be creative, right? Write them on Post-its, keep a daily journal, everybody track these. I think this is a joint activity for parents and for kids. And it really helps you kind of focus on what are some of the successes when you can't necessarily control a lot of the other things. And there may be a good amount of negative things that might be happening kind of in the world around us. This will really help them and kind of gear their brains to kind of think more about the positives and make that a little bit easier to see even when times are challenging. So it's a skill that can certainly insulate you from anxiety and depression in the future. Kind of thinking about it as this is like more the glass is half full versus the glass is half empty, so to speak, and kind of training a little bit of that mindset. It can be really helpful. And again, all of these things are things that wouldn't take very long, but would really help kids be able to count on and know that these are kind of certainly things that we're going to do each day and be accountable for and look forward to. Creating calm in response to fear. Sometimes this is easier said than done, but the opposite of kind of being afraid, I think, is being calm. And calm doesn't mean that I'm not stressed, right? So calm doesn't mean that I'm not stressed. It doesn't mean that I might not have a lot going on, but having a kind of a sense of how can I help to kind of get calm in some of these situations and help kids to kind of see and model that that's really what we kind of want in this situation. It's normal to be stressed. Many people are stressed, right? Fear is a normal response to a stressful situation. It's really what we do with the fear, so keeping the fear kind of under control, that's going to help us predict how do we cope with this. Can we cope with this more successfully versus, more stressfully or kind of less successfully? So I think really helping kids to understand that being fearful in this situation is normal, right? You want to be a little bit afraid of the coronavirus to make you certain that you're going to follow through with the precautions. So fear is a very protective emotion too. That fight or flight response that you feel in situations is really helpful because it teaches us something. It tells us that there might be a danger that's there. And so, you can never eliminate fear in this situation. I think what you want to focus on is helping them understand that that fearful response is normal, that most people feel afraid to a certain extent about the coronavirus or getting that, or right, what happens if they don't wear a mask, and that's normal. That's how everybody's feeling. I think monitoring your response to news and stress as a parent, kids often mirror those stress levels. Watching the nightly news can sometimes be a very stressful activity, helpful, right? Because you want to stay connected and you want to know what's going on, but making sure that you're kind of monitoring what's your response to that and how you're kind of talking about that with kids. Providing a time to listen to kids' feelings and thoughts. As a parent, I think the tendency to want to have a solution in a situation, I think it's one of the reasons that parenting through this situation has been so challenging, is that there are not a lot of easy kind of actionable solutions that we can say today, hey, here are the 2 or 3 things that we can do to make this better, right? We can't make the, pandemic go away. We can't fix that as a parent, just like I want to make sure that I put a Band-Aid over, right, a boo-boo and that we move on in the day. We can't really do that with a situation like this. And so really providing a time to listen to your child's feelings and thoughts. So again, maybe during that 15 minutes a day, or maybe just kind of soliciting some of those thoughts in a really kind of open way as a part of your, chit chat about the day or conversation at dinner or in the car to and from, different activities. Tell me a little bit about how you're feeling. after school today? Or how are you feeling about, starting school back after Thanksgiving or having this break? Tell me what you're hearing from your friends, and really focusing on more kind of open-ended questions versus closed questions. So not a yes or a no, but really helping them to feel like you want to understand their perspectives and hear their thoughts and feelings. Validating those emotions, and validating that they're also sharing and communicating with you. We want kids to let us know this. One of the biggest protective factors against kind of anxiety and depression and helping to manage those outcomes and increase positive outcomes is having good communication with kids so that they feel comfortable letting you know when they're struggling, or letting you know when they're not struggling, right? And successes too. And so really validating that they're sharing this with you and you really appreciate that. For kids who are worrying a little bit more, so for kids who are really worrying a lot or having a lot of fears that are coming up, you might designate actually a very specific kind of worry time. So to help kind of manage this and keep it under control, you can say kind of write down some of these thoughts as they happen, and let's make sure to have some time where we share that during the day. We want to make sure that that time doesn't get too big, that we're not spending hours talking about worries each day, right? Something like 15 minutes to kind of share the worries and get them out, and then be able to move on, right? And kind of reinforce some of these other messages about how are we helping to do that? How do we know that we're working to keep people safe? To again, help that worry be a little bit more manageable and not feel like it's growing and kind of taking over more of your day. Providing helpful information to kids about how they can keep themselves safe. So what are they doing already that's really helping to create a safer environment, can help reduce fear a lot. So mask wearing, hand washing, and distancing. Those are three things that we know for sure that have been positive health messages that have been repeated throughout this pandemic that we know are helping keep people safe. And they're also things that you can control, right? So kids can do those things. They can control that. Part of fear is also feeling out of control. And so these are things that they can really do to feel like they're making a big difference, not just for themselves, but for everybody else as well. Really important to reinforce that message with schools. Limiting news watching. So knowing what kids are watching, and if they're overhearing the news that you're watching, or they're tuning into news on their own, taking a look at those histories, right, on the devices to see what are they reading about and what are they thinking about, so that you have an idea about where they're kind of accessing some of their information, and so that you can monitor that and kind of help give them helpful information. Again, you can find a lot of, if I Googled, almost anything, right, the things that come up are sometimes a little less helpful than I might hope, right? If I Googled, right, teenage depression, I would find things that I didn't like at the top of that list. And so making sure that you're aware of what that content is so that you can help to kind of manage it and have good conversations with kids about it. Creating predictability and unpredictable times. And so one of the things that we know creates a lot of stress for kids is that having kind of unpredictability or a lack of stability in day-to-day life can be really stressful, and it increases the risk of kind of behavior challenges and emotion challenges. So predictability, we know, decreases that stress and helps to kind of stabilize behavior and emotions during this time. So we really want to focus in a couple of areas. So making sure that daily routines stay the same as much as possible. Even if that's a little bit different each day of the week, or it's different Monday, Wednesday, and Friday than it is Tuesday and Thursday, right? For kids who are in hybrid situations, or when you have school breaks, these strategies are really helpful. So having that same morning routine on days that you're at school, on days when you're at home, even on the weekend, right? We want them getting up about at the same time. We want them going to sleep about at the same time each day to help them really learn that schedule. Thinking about creating an afternoon schedule. So kids, again, part of what we learned from some of the data is that kids are not in actually childcare situations nearly as much as they were before. So parents, if they are working at home, are kind of managing that childcare. But that means that you have several hours. I could say from my own personal experience that, my son feels like the workday maybe ends at 3 when it doesn't, right, necessarily, because he used to do other things, right, from 3 to 5. And so thinking about that and helping kids really understand what can they do with some of this time that they have, that they're likely to have a lot more extra time on their hands than they did before, because they're not having activities. They may not be having a babysitter or going to after school clubs and things like that. So helping kids know how to anchor this time. So what can they do when they get home? What are the things that they can look forward to and occupy their time productively? Bedtime routines, we want those to stay the same, right? Who's putting you to bed today? That might be mom today, it might be grandma, it might be dad, depending on what your childcare situation is, but you want those routines to stay the same and predictable to the largest extent possible. Creating ways for kids to get in touch with you if they need something. I feel like this has been a big part of kind of this stress for both parents and kids that I've heard about a lot and developed a lot of systems about throughout this time. Is figuring out ways that you're available. So when kids like see that you're kind of on a Zoom meeting or you have headphones in a lot of the day and that you're on the phone a lot, what are ways that kids can predict when you're available? So are there check-in times that you can kind of designate for even a couple of minutes? What's the sign for, yes, you can kind of interrupt me and come and, you know, ask me a question versus not. So helping them to really predict how do they kind of get some of those needs met during the day while you're working. And really acknowledging for them that each day might be a little bit different. Every day could be a little bit different. And different doesn't mean that it's unpredictable, that it's stressful, that it's scary. Having it be different isn't necessarily a bad thing. And so doing what you can to help kids really understand what's the plan or what's the schedule for each day. Kids really love and thrive on structure. It's why I think some of that school environment changing has been so hard, because the school environment is really structured. You kind of know what you're doing for most of that time. There's very little unstructured time at school. And that helps kids to feel a little bit more relaxed, like they know what's coming next, like they know kind of what mindset to be in. And so helping to do that for your time at home too can be really helpful. So what's the plan and what's the schedule? For younger kids, they're going to need reminders about that. And so if there's a visual schedule that they can kind of follow, or a timer that helps them see how long is it, you know, until you're done with the workday, or how long is it until, you know, they're done with their homework, can really help them to kind of see and manage this time a little bit better. Having a brief like morning meeting or kind of family announcements. So schools use a lot of these and kind of start the day with announcements, or like a morning meeting where they kind of talk about, you know, some different fun things that are going on and reviewing activities for the day. I think having that concept for home can be really helpful too, right? Because it might be that, oh, today's, you know, wacky Wednesday. So let's think about, you know, what silly PJs that you're going to put on when you get home, and you know what we're going to do as kind of a silly activity tonight. And so helping them to feel like, again, that they have some of this predictability day to day and week to week. But even if those times are different each day, if the person picking them up from school is different, that you're helping to predict that for them. Again, kids who are anxious, this is even more important for, because they might be worried when the parent who usually picks them up doesn't pick them up. What are they thinking? Or is there something wrong? Is there a reason that this parent isn't picking me up? So really predicting even some of those common day-to-day types of situations can be really helpful. Creating connectedness to combat loneliness. So the way I think that we really work to help decrease the impact of loneliness is we figure out how to be connected in a lot of new ways. I know that screen time has been one of the most common conversations that I've had, and I wish that we actually had excellent guidelines for how do we balance all of these, you know, screens and devices during a time where screens and devices are necessary, right? They're necessary for school. They're necessary to keep us connected with, you know, friends and family members. And I don't think that there's a lot of easy answers for that, but really finding opportunities to connect. And I think prioritizing that connectedness is something that I would focus on more than I would kind of focus on some of the screen time. So what are you doing with that screen time to kind of feel connected, or to reach out, or to have that be kind of a social experience? So creating a shared Netflix movie night, I just put some ideas kind of in here. So what are opportunities to connect? Again, I think headed into the winter months when we're not going to necessarily be able to be outside in the same way that we were in the fall and in the summer, I think these things are going to become more important. So designating a weekly time that you're talking with family members, that you're going to call grandma, or that you're going to call a favorite aunt, or that you're going to you know, kind of dial into a, you know, a religious service, or, you know, a church group. Creating weekly times that you're doing some of these things based on, you know, again, what are those important values for your family? Texting or FaceTiming with a friend each day, really setting that goal and expectation. Again, I'm thinking about that for kind of younger kids and adults, actually, right? Who are, you know, the people that you want to stay connected with each day, and how are we making that a priority? Really kind of thinking about checking on friends and relatives who haven't reached out for a while. And so I think it's been hard, right? Not all younger kids obviously have access to devices at the same way that we're talking about our middle schoolers and kind of certainly our high schoolers, but really encouraging them to kind of reach out and be a part of making connectedness a priority. I think if we really all focused on connecting with everybody, or connecting with a person we haven't heard from in a while, I think everyone's going to feel again, some of that value of that social connection and that caring. And it's going to help us with some of those mental health challenges that we were learning about at the beginning of the presentation. sharing family dinners and movies and game nights, Zooming with friends from all over the country. I don't know that we thought about doing this on FaceTime before, but I think it's become an activity that like we're seeing people that we haven't seen in maybe years before, when it could have been kind of accessible to us, but we weren't really forced to have kind of a Zoom account before, right? Or we didn't think about doing, joint FaceTime calls, and really making those things priorities. Considering again, this balance with connectedness and screen time. And so I think the rules about, having 2 hours of screen time a day. So the American Academy of Pediatrics for years has said we don't want kids to have more than 2 hours of screen time a day. That's screen time on all devices. I think that rule, again, I'm not saying we just throw that rule out the window, but I think that's not the reality of the situation that we're living in, especially when you're considering the amount of screen time that you have for kind of hybrid or remote learning in certain situations. And so really thinking about what are you doing with that screen time, right? So having kind of a video game time where you're kind of online chatting with some of your friends that you haven't seen in person in a long time could be a really valuable social activity. So not saying kind of as a blanket rule, no, in some of those activities, really learning what are kids doing, right? And what are they going to do with some of that time and the screen time to feel connected. Scheduling a daily time to kind of get out of the house, right? To move around, get out, to walk, to do something a little bit different, to kind of get out of your same physical environment. Again, I'm also thinking about for older kids, designating kind of downstairs time. So saying like, we really want people to be outside of their kind of like room or office or area. That's as much for parents as it is for, kids, that we want everybody to kind of be downstairs. That doesn't mean that everybody has to be sitting together, right, doing an activity, but we want everybody to be kind of in the mix, so to speak, right, to be kind of out of their space and kind of jointly together to give us a time to have some of that connection. So again, I think those are just some of the ideas that we might be able to do to really create some of this connectedness to combat this isolation that we're experiencing. So I have listed here references and resources. So these are direct links to the articles and the studies that I referenced today. And there are also additional resources that I think would just be helpful to know about. So this first one from the CDC is again about kind of a resource kit and a toolkit for parents and kind of coping with this for kids of all ages. So I think again, that first resource from the CDC could be a really helpful one. I think all of these other resources help you to kind of give some talking points for kids about, how do we think about safety during, the time of coronavirus. There are quick cards from the World Health Organization that give you like your top highlight tips. Some of that information we covered tonight, the top kind of tips for parents in terms of coping as well. And then some of the specific resources. And then questions. So saving some time for questions for all of you guys to kind of share some of your experience and thoughts or questions or concerns that you might have about parenting in this unique time. So any questions for you guys? Anything that would be helpful for us to think about? Anybody, anything that would be helpful for us to kind of think about together? I know if you guys have one question that's kind of coming up, the likelihood that other people have very similar questions. It's kind of a brave first question to throw out there. I'm sure that it's going to be relevant for many others who are listening as well.
Well, you got a nice compliment. You have a message that says, I loved all your real life examples. Thank you.
Oh, sure. Absolutely.
But I don't see any questions. Oh, wait a minute. Somebody has a question. Hold on. Okay.
Awesome. Yeah, I also feel like this has been a time that I think we've all been forced to be as creative as possible. I feel like I'm always trying to be very creative as a psychologist to think about new ways to do things. I feel like the pandemic has forced me to really kind of be outside the box creative. So if there are other kind of questions or examples that you guys might like, we can certainly talk about those as well.
Well, if I'm working this software correctly, I'm about to have somebody ask a question. So let's just see. All right.
Yeah, a good question. I think I can see that one too. So the question was, how can you encourage your child to go out of their comfort zone during this time? Oh, a really good question. because I think kids are going to have to try new things and different things to really feel connected. I think the other interesting part that your question kind of reminds me about as well, because this is a really good one, is that I have heard actually a lot more focus on kind of social perception, social anxiety than I heard even before the pandemic. So if you think about this, right? I mean, so Janet and I had a pre-call to make sure that everything was kind of working for this presentation. But part of it was also making sure that we were like sitting in a place that was well lighted, that like we're doing things that are going to be helpful to facilitate this. And I had never thought about that so much before doing telehealth 100% of the time. All of a sudden, I never thought about like taking my, best selfie or lighting situation. And so I think kids have really had to be confronted with some things that are so challenging, right? That people are kind of, their perception is that people are kind of looking and paying attention to, what do you look like on a Zoom, or what are you doing with this picture, or what did you look like for class today? And I think the reality of the situation is that people are actually not focusing on that nearly as much as they were before. So I feel like part of my answer to your question is to really help kids to reinforce that some of this anxiety that they're experiencing about having to do FaceTime with people when they might prefer to text message, because texting was kind of the most common way probably that most junior and high schoolers, junior high and high schoolers communicated with each other, right? FaceTime was not something that they did a lot of. And a lot of what you're doing to kind of increase this connection is you're encouraging them to kind of take steps to, like you said, be out of your comfort zone a little bit. And I think that is anxiety producing, right? So kind of saying, I'm going to set up a FaceTime call with somebody. It's like, well, I've never FaceTime with somebody before. How am I going to do that? And so I think you really want to start by having, again, encouraging kind of the sharing of this, of what are their thoughts and feelings about the situation. So what are their kind of worries, or what are their concerns, or what are their thoughts and feelings about having a FaceTime call, or trying to see if you could set up, a chat group with your friends, via text message, or an online kind of game group. You can set up groups for that in particular. What about suggesting a Netflix game night? What's the worst thing that could happen from doing that? So I think really helping to understand, because every child's response to that is going to be a little bit different. So I go back to it first, how do I really understand kind of what might be their hesitation in the situation, and kind of where is that hesitation coming from? And then I really think about how can we take small and kind of baby steps to encouraging that. So if the big worry is that I think it's going to be weird that I suggested this, right? Like nobody's said it so far. Like what if people feel like it's a bad idea? Then you really want to think about what's something that could be a little bit more manageable than that. So if you don't want to say like a Netflix, movie night is way too out there, then maybe saying, let's connect with each other, on a Saturday or Sunday via FaceTime, or have kind of a FaceTime group chat. Could we do that? Would anybody be open to that? Because that might be a little bit easier than kind of taking a risk on one of those bigger activities. So I think you want to break it down into kind of smaller parts. And I actually, so my own kids would tell you that I have a strong bias towards rating scales, right? I want to rate what they think about all of these activities, right? How likely would you be to do this on a scale of 1 to 10? My daughter would, like, my middle school would be rolling her eyes now because she knows that I ask that all the time. So, what's the likelihood that you would suggest doing that, right? On a scale of 1 to 10. And if it's like, 10 being like, I would do that 100%. 1, I wouldn't do that at all, right? 10 is enough numbers to kind of give you some difference and really kind of gauge what are they feeling like is possible and what are they feeling like is really kind of a no-go. And you would start by encouraging some of those activities that are a little bit lower in terms of stress level, and also a little bit more achievable, that they feel like they're more likely to do and could do pretty quickly. Like reaching out to your best friend via FaceTime, for instance, or asking, your friend to, join you in, like a chat or something like that, or a daily chat, and kind of check in with each other at like 3:30 or something each day. That might be more manageable. So I would start with some of those smaller steps, but understanding where it's kind of coming from, I think will help a lot to kind of predict how do you encourage these things and how do you take those steps. Some of it's, I think that kids are also struggling, like parents are, to even think of what are the ideas, that they're kind of at a loss to think about what are all the different things that I could do when I can't really see anybody, right? I used to just walk down the street and see somebody, or I would see people at, this activity that we'd all have to go to. So I think part of it could be that they're just not thinking about it. And so having that conversation, I think, can be really helpful as a starting point, and then just really going through some different activities and having them read it and see if that generates a little bit more of a response. So awesome question. Thank you for asking it. Being a
We
brave
do-
first question.
Yeah, we do have another question here. It
Awesome.
says, at what point should a parent consider medication to cope with their child's anxiety during these times?
Yeah, so I think that's a really, really good question. And so part of what I want to kind of anchor parents to think about is how much is the anxiety creating an impact and preventing you from doing day-to-day activities? So as we talked about, being fearful and being stressed in this situation can be a really normal response. But when it starts to really prevent you from engaging in life, from doing things that you need to do to kind of go to school, to get schoolwork done, to engage with family, to be able to take steps to do the things that we kind of need you to do each day to be successful, that's when I start to worry about that, right? So it's that impairment. And so how is the anxiety really creating impairment and impact that, and how much is that also a change from what you saw pre-pandemic? Because the world has changed, right? So, I mean, kids aren't able to do a lot of what they were able to do before. But if this used to be, a child who would engage and was pretty willing to do a lot of these things, and then over the course of time, you've seen less and less of that. And now they're really not even doing some of the basic things that you really kind of need them to do without being too stressed. I think those are the signs that would tell me that maybe reaching out for some assistance would be helpful. What we also know about kids and teenagers is that kids and teenagers really respond to what's called cognitive behavioral therapy very successfully. So if they haven't had a course of therapy, and again, it's specifically cognitive behavioral therapy, so that's the evidence-based treatment for childhood anxiety. The goal of CBT is to get you to kind of help to start doing things and taking steps to lean into approaching situations versus kind of avoiding situations, and doing that little by little, kind of in the same way, a similar way that we talked about kind of with that rating scale. And so I think if there hasn't been kind of a therapy intervention, then you might consider that as a first line intervention. I think for anxiety, if again, you feel like it's super excessive and you're not really able to do any of those kind of activities in daily life or really tolerate doing that, I think that's when people kind of think about medication. Consultation with your pediatrician is a good idea as well. So pediatricians are very, I think, adept at understanding kind of what are the evidence-based tools that we have for treatment, and what are the medical options as well. And so I certainly recommend that people talk with their pediatrician if you know that pediatrician and feel pretty comfortable, and say, what would be your advice in this situation? Here's what we're experiencing. What would you say that we kind of do to help manage this, or what do you think might be most helpful? Medication can certainly be, helpful. I obviously don't prescribe medication, so I can't give you specific information about that. What are the risks and benefits? But I think it's also really important to know that kids respond to therapy interventions very quickly. So oftentimes in kind of 4 to 6 sessions, you can see a significant difference in some of the concerns that kind of brought you to treatment. So as you're taking those little steps, you should see change pretty quickly with a very evidence-based intervention. So that's an awesome question. Yeah, when you're really seeing it be too much for kids and they're just so stressed that they're not really able to kind of engage in daily life, and you're seeing that go on for a longer period of time, that's when you start to think about this kind of crossover between typical kind of anxiety and kind of adjustment response to this might be something a little more. Thank you. That's a great question.
Okay, I don't see any more questions. I did just put out our poll to see, we're just curious whether you, as attendees, have a preference on the time of day that we may hold the next workshop. We've got them all lined up. We have the dates all scheduled, but we are a bit flexible on the time of day, and didn't know whether, I know that sometimes 6 o'clock at night is a difficult time for parents with children. So but it looks like 6 o'clock so far seems to be the favored one. So we'll see how it comes out. But anyway, we're just offering some other times.
Yeah.
And I think if anybody has any more questions, now would be the time. Otherwise, we will say thank you.
Yeah, please let us know if there's anything else we can do to kind of talk through some of those things together.
Okay, well, thank you so much. And I think this was really helpful. Like I said, it is going to be, we'll have it, the recording of this. So if people want to see it or hear it again, and also if they want to send it on to somebody else, we've got it available. So
awesome.